Good afternoon. I am Dr. Cynthia Gooch Grayson, the Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Metropolitan Community College. Thank you for joining us today to learn about a unique museum in our Black History Month series of virtual programming. Black History Month is an annual celebration of achievements by African Americans and a time for recognizing the central role of Blacks in the United States history. Also known as African American History Month, the event Black History Month grew out of Negro History Week. Dr. Carter G. Woodson is known as the father of Black history. Reverend Jesse Edward Moreland was a collaborator with Woodson in the development of Negro History Week. Since 1976, every United States president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. Help us to know how to continue to provide quality virtual programming by sharing your comments about this celebration and event on the online evaluation at mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL. Again, that's mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL. The address will also be placed in the chat. It is my distinct honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce to you my friend, very good friend, Dr. Robert M. Davis, who is the president and CEO of America's Black Holocaust Museum, a role that he has held since September of 2019. Dr. Davis assumed leadership on the eve of the reopening of the beloved museum, which closed in 2008, 2 years after the passing of its founder, Dr. James Cameron. Dr. Davis has an extensive background in nonprofit museum management, education, and fundraising. Most recently, Dr. Davis was principal of the nonprofit strategic consulting firm DRMD Strategies LLC and former president and CEO to two Iowa organizations, the Dubuque County Historical Society and the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium. He is the former president and CEO of the Zoological Society of Milwaukee. Prior to the Zoological Society, Dr. Davis was the Vice President of Education for Chicago's Lincoln Park Zoo. Dr. Davis has a doctorate in veterinary medicine from the famed Tuskegee University School of Veterinary Medicine in Tuskegee, Alabama, and a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science and Biology, also from Tuskegee Institute and University, which was founded by Booker T. Washington, and where the prominent scientist Dr. George Washington Carver taught for over 20 years. Dr. Davis is a board member of the Association of African American Museums and also a board member and former vice chair of the American Alliance of Museums. Other previous leadership roles include the Vice President of Education at Lincoln Park Zoo, which I indicated previously, and the Director of Education and External Affairs at Zoo Atlanta. He was also the first African American to serve as the supervisory veterinary medical officer at the Smithsonian's National Zoological Park Department of Animal Health in Washington, D.C. Please give a warm, on this chilly day, a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Bert Davis as he presents America's Black Holocaust Museum, a unique experience for visitors from near and far. Dr. Davis.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cynthia Gooch Grayson. As she indicated, she is a very dear friend. For the sake of clarity, I think we've probably known each other close to 30 years. And of course, when I first met her, she was in grammar school or something like that. So it's an honor to be here. So I want to lay some ground rules. And they're not going to be very extensive, and they're not going to be very plentiful. And that is, I want you all to choose to repeat after me, either out loud or to yourself, these words, and that is, we are no longer celebrating Black History Month. We are now celebrating Blacks in history. There is a distinction. It is not a month. As a matter of fact, we are going back to the old adage that we had heard probably on some commercial back in the 90s, and that is 365 Black. So let us strike Black History Month from our vernacular or our lexicon, and let us embrace the fact that we are celebrating Blacks in history, as well as we shall continue to celebrate women in history, Latinos in history, Asian Americans in history, because we all are contributors to history. And none of us should be channeled or funneled into one month, one day, or even one season. The fabric of America is made up of this myriad of cultures and ethnicities that makes us the nation that we are. Now, our stories are painful, but they're very unique, but they are also what we need to embrace. And so that is why America's Black Holocaust is so important, because it is a museum, but it's also a memorial. And the distinction between a museum and a memorial is a museum basically interprets artifacts and history and culture. We are a museum, but we also take it a little further, and we don't create history, but we contextualize history. And we've decided through our founder to contextualize history through the eyes and the experiences of African Americans and African Americans in the United States, starting a little bit of the history pre-slavery, but then slavery and post-slavery. So once again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dr. Cynthia. Some of you are probably thinking, okay, so this guy is a veterinarian, and now he's running and working at the America's Black Holocaust Museum, and I see a couple of you all shaking your head and nodding. So let me give you a little context and history to that. Yes, I have worked in zoos and aquariums for nearly 30 years and served as the president and CEO at the Zoological Society at the Milwaukee County Zoo here for nearly 11 years, and then I left. In the summer of 2019, I received a call from some of my friends that were here, and they said, "You're coming back." And I said, "Yeah, I'll be back next month," because we were going to plan a golf outing. And they were like, "No, dude, you're coming back." And I literally said to myself, "No, heck no, I'm not." As a matter of fact, I didn't say heck, I said something else. And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, there's been this groundswell of individuals who are bringing America's Black Holocaust Museum back. And it's pretty much a lock that you have to be the person to lead that effort." And when I thought about it, I was like, I don't think so. And then I remembered Dr. Cameron, and I started going back and reading the history of the museum and realized that it was something that I had to do. And let me explain to you why. So Dr. Cameron was a kind of a wiry kid who grew up in Marion, Indiana. And as all of you know, or most of you should know, the origins of the KKK was in Southern Indiana. In the late 20s, he was a young teenager, and on a hot August night in 1930, when he was 17, he survived a public lynching. He is one of the only known survivors of a public lynching in all of the United States throughout our history. He is distinguished, though, as being the only survivor of a public lynching to actually write a book about it and then subsequently open a museum about it. the story goes that he was 2 or 3 nights before at home, and two of his adult friends asked him to take a ride with them. And they went and they robbed people, and they robbed a couple, and someone invariably ended up being shot. They rounded them up the next day, and they jailed him. Because he was a minor, they were still deliberating what they were going to do with him. So I want to point you to one of the most iconic photographs of a lynching in the United States. And that is these two young men that are hanging kind of in tandem from a tree. So if you Google lynching in Indiana, or if you actually Google lynching in the United States and you click to the images, it is probably the second to third most recognized visualization of a lynching in United States history. He was supposed to be the third body on that tree. Because he was young and because he had such a great reputation of being a seeker of education and a good person, they literally walked him out. He had the noose on his neck, and a woman screamed through the audience, "That's little Jimmy. He couldn't possibly have had anything to do with this." The deputies then released him and told him, quote unquote, "Run. That's the picture. Run and don't turn around." Now, for the sake of once again contextualization, I want you to look at the picture. And I was actually going to talk about this, but I'm so glad that you guys pulled this picture up. You see, there's a man at the bottom who's pointing at the bodies. His great grandson contacted the museum back in, I think it was 2018, and talked to the individuals who were looking to reopen the museum. He talked about the fact that his family through the generations knew that their grandfather, father, and great-grandfather had been involved with this, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. They weren't allowed to discuss it or embrace it one way, positively or negatively. Our plan is to reconnect with this individual because he wants to actually come and visit the museum once we open. As you can imagine, that's probably going to be a very, very powerful meeting. Because of course as you can imagine, does not subscribe to any of this behavior. But what it does is this picture demonstrates so many other elements just beyond the visualization of these two men being lynched. But the stories that are unfolding from these occurrences, the stories that are told because of how these gatherings, how lynchings were not just punitive measures, but they've turned and evolved into social engagements, where postcards were created with lynched individuals on them and mailed to relatives around the country, how there were barbecues and parties and picnics that were actually constructed around the act of lynching. And this is a part of American history that has never been told or not been told accurately. And so this is the reason why we have museums, and this is the reason why we have memorials, because the stories of our cultures, of our ethnicities, and of our practices, and of who we are and how we interact are so very sacred and are important for us to embrace as part of our past, but it also helps to form our collective and individual futures. So to get back to now me coming back here, and then I'll move along. Once I realized who Dr. Cameron was, I said, I got to do this because it's so very important, especially in 2019, because of the way the United States was evolving even at that time. So I came back, and we're in the process now we have basically two trains that are on the tracks running parallel or in tandem. When the museum, Dr. Cameron died in 2006, and then the museum closed in 2008, as our Dr. Cynthia referenced. And that was because of two things. One, because Dr. Cameron wasn't alive anymore. But the other one was because the country was going through a recession. And there were a lot of cultural institutions that were suffering. And so the museum closed in 2008. What grew from that was the creation of the virtual museum, which was created by 3 individuals and a host and cadre of other volunteers who decided to bring the museum back, not in the physical space, but in a virtual essence. So they started the work in 2009, and they had a soft launch in 2010, and then the virtual museum became permanent in 2011, 2012. And it has grown and evolved now to a virtual existence where it is one of our key educational functions. It has over 3,300 pages of content. We typically get visitors from over 200 countries and close to 2 million visitors a year. We have not tracked this accurately, but we know that there have been dozens of school curriculum who have either been developed because of the content of the museum, but hundreds of school curriculum from around the world that has referenced the museum. So if you think about it like this, typically a museum or a cultural institution will open, and then invariably now, because of technology, they then adopt and create a virtual presence. Because the museum closed, our only presence was a virtual presence. So it's a little unorthodox from that vantage point. And then, as I said, these two trains are moving kind of in tandem. That then, about 10 years ago, there was another small group that was a breakout group from the virtual museum group that said, we really need to move to try to recreate this physical space. And so basically they broke ground, and the physical space, which is part of a multi-use facility, was recreated. We plan to reopen the museum or re-emerge the museum during this past summer, but of course, because of COVID, Milwaukee was the host to the DNC. And so we were going to have a soft opening during the DNC, and then that all folded. So right now, we have decided that we are not going to reopen the museum until it's safe, until all the elements are in play, because in this situation, unlike other references to movies and other institutions, just because you build it or just because it opens doesn't mean that people are going to come. We want people to come and enjoy the museum truly experientially, like we would really hope for them. This material, the content and the context of the museum is very powerful. It's very emotional. As a matter of fact, we kind of strategically have boxes of Kleenex around the museum because we've seen where people have literally broken down after this particular exhibit experience. So this is actually the entrance to the museum. And as you walk through and meandered through the museum, the stories that are shared and unfolded are very, very powerful and very emotional. So we decided that we wouldn't open the museum because we don't want people there in masks. We want people to be able to hug each other, to console each other. And so we are looking at potentially reopening the museum during the late second or early third quarter 2021. But as you can imagine, even with your workplace situation and scenarios, that really depends on several other factors that are beyond our control. The vaccination schedules, whether or not any of these offshoots of the original virus can be controlled through the various inoculations and vaccinations. So right now, we are looking at second quarter, third quarter to reopening the museum. So let's talk about the purpose of museums and why museums are important. As I indicated before, museums are important because of how we capture the essence of our experiences. So let me go back to something that became really kind of paramount to me probably in the last 5 years, and I didn't really realize this. And that is, I know many of you have had this happen to you. It happened to me at the time that it happened, and it probably happened to many of you. And that is, for some reason, people, I'm 60 years old, so I have witnessed a lot of our iconic figures who have died. But for some reason, when Prince died, it really hurt and hit me in a way that I couldn't explain it. And so, all of these social media posts were going back and forth. But one thing that I heard that stuck with me, and it made me understand the true power and the true essence of how we capture experiences and why museums and cultural institutions are so very important. There was this one person that was being interviewed, and I think she was a psychologist, and she was talking about the effect of how internationally people were mourning because of Prince. And she said the thing about mourning a superstar or someone of that ilk or caliber is that you are mourning the fact that they died. But what you're really mourning is the fact that they died, and it immediately brings you back to how they made you feel at certain points in time in your life. And I really thought about that, and I said, that's it. Because when Prince was most popular for me was during the time I was in college and was probably in the most important developmental times of my life as a man. And so I then correlate that back to the essence of why museums are so important and why these cultural museums are so important, because they remind us of things that have even happened in our generation, but more importantly, it connects us with experiences of people of the same race and culture and other races and cultures that still strike at the heart of who we are and our own generational and familial experiences. And so just because you're Jewish or just because you're Asian or just because you're a woman, just because you're young or just because you're old, it doesn't mean that there's not a common thread. It's not a commonality of the humanity of people and our shared experiences. And so I submit to you, if you've gone to museums, even if you've gone to a zoo, and in my estimation, zoos are museums, they just have living artifacts, that there's always something that happens there that makes you think about something about yourself or something about your family member. Which now fast forward as to why America's Black Holocaust Museum is so important. And that is one of the things that we as Americans have not done so well with, and other continents and countries have, and that is to come to grips with the reality of our history, of our shared experiences, and how our history and our shared experiences have affected everyone who participated in it, willfully or non-willingly. And so we typically think about slavery and Jim Crow as a component of the Black experience only. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, African Americans have done the worst job of embracing the circumstances that have allowed us to be who we are because of slavery. We don't like to deal with it. As a matter of fact, those of you who are brown or Black on this call, regardless of your age, and then all of us, tell me how many times you guys have, through your family discussions at the dinner table, through your educational experiences, have talked about, shared, learned about slavery and all of the manifestations that have occurred that have brought us to where we are today. February 2021. It doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, you guys have just seen in the course of these past 4 days, a school system in Utah gave the parents of their students the ability to opt out of any Black history curriculum. Y'all don't have to deal with it. It's not important. It's not relevant. You don't need it to matriculate, not only through school, but through life. Now, of course, you know that 2 nights ago, they must have got a tremendous amount of heat, Dr. Cynthia, because they backpedaled, they reversed it. So there were some significant phone calls or emails, or somebody pounded on some desks, but they reversed it. But the point, ladies and gentlemen, is could you imagine that we would even be discussing such a thing after George Floyd this summer, where not only Black Lives Matter and how people in the media has characterized it as being this violent onslaught of looters. Let me tell you something. I'm going to tell you the truth, and you can hear it and you can quote me on this. In this summer of demonstrations, there were different strata of participants. You had the people who literally were heartbroken around the world, just not in the United States, who decided enough is enough. And this is the distinction between now and in the late 60s with the civil rights marches. Lots of people participated, primarily young people, in the civil rights marches, but they were restricted and constricted to certain locales in the United States. Summer of 2020 marches was an international protest. Every continent, people on every continent of every age, every culture, every ethnicity, and every hue, every sex, and every ability took to the streets. Enough was enough. First strata. Second strata, people who had to work, even though we were doing on a lockdown and pandemic, they took to the streets afterwards. Students, graduate students, still peaceful. Once it got dark, those people went home for the most part. See, they didn't want to report that. Most people went home because they had seen what happened the night before. After it got dark, you then had the people who wanted to brave marching during dusk. And then you had the fourth. They were the rioters and looters who didn't have an agenda but to riot and loot, to take advantage of the fact that there were people and there was coverage and they were out there. They had no linkage to any kind of peaceful protest. They had no linkage to Black Lives Matter. They had one single intent: anarchy and looting, period. So could you imagine in February of 2021, us even discussing the fact that you don't have to deal with Black? It's because we as a country have not gotten to the point like they did in South Africa after Nelson Mandela was released, to have these conversations where there has to be accountability on all parts. And so one of the tenets of our programming for America's Black Holocaust Museum is going to be hosting these peaceful, respectful, loving conversations, convening these interactions, now of course virtually, but at some point virtually and at our museum, to discuss these most important, sensitive, and emotional conversations about race and about the effects of slavery on us individually and the United States as a collective. So museums are important to do many of these things. America's Black Holocaust Museum is really, we are really going to step into and continue to step into being a convener of these most difficult conversations, but yet again, and yet and still in a very peaceful and respectful manner. We've already started this by creation of a book club, whereby we had close to 75 or 80. I see that Mia is on the Zoom. I think it was probably between 60 and 80 participants. And I can't, now of course I can't remember the name of the book, but it was a young African-American woman author who was talking about what it means to be Black in a white world, socially and professionally. But here was the thing that was most important that struck me, and that is at least 3/4 of the participants were white. And here in the city of Milwaukee, we are unfortunately poised with a stigma as being one of the most racially segregated cities in the entire country. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that at some other point. But I was, and I don't want this to sound like anything other than the way I'm going to say it, and that is, I was heartened to know that there were people just beyond Black people who really wanted to have these conversations. And so we broke off into several different groups to discuss several different points of the book. And to the person who was in my group, that was, by the way, all white except for one Black woman, everyone had this one resounding comment, and that was, after seeing George Floyd, I realized that there was so much about the American experience, most specifically, the African-American experience, that I should have known about, but I didn't know anything about, not one thing. And regardless of whether I have Black family members or Black friends, none of that came to fore. The important thing was that they actually realized that they needed to understand. They needed to connect with some people who could help them understand. And so it was an experience that we're going to continually have book club readings every month. We're going to have another one at the end of this month where we're going to highlight Dr. Cameron's book, A Time of Terror, that chronicles his life post him surviving the lynching. But that's one way of us coming together and convening discussions after reading these books, or talking about our shared experiences. Another thing that happened and was primarily due to our loss of George Floyd was the loss of George Floyd made museums as a whole, who typically are not advocates other than advocates for or creating advocacy around things that are germane just to museums, okay? We typically don't go out and do things like the NAACP or the Urban League or different chambers or just a myriad of other non-for-profit organizations. But what it caused museums around the country, all museums, was to realize that we actually are truly pivotal to be change agents, especially around social change. And this was something that we hadn't necessarily embraced because we didn't have to. We were kind of in our very sweet spot, and that is we collect these artifacts, we collect these stories, we collect these, these things that are part of history, and we interpret them and we display them, we have conversations around them, but we don't actually initiate any things that have discussion or actions around change, especially social change. This has now been adopted by almost all different strata of museums, whether it's an art museum or a children's museum, a history museum, because now the context of our existence here in the United States has changed forever because of one incident. Now, there were hundreds, right, of other incidents where people have died unarmed at the hands of whomever. But this one was singularly important because we got a chance to witness it from start to finish on our cell phones, on our televisions, on our laptops. And so what we've realized now is that there is becoming now an evolution of even who we are as museums and cultural institutions, to the point now that we have to not only look at our programming from a construct of just sharing information about the museum, but that is convening conversations, whether virtually or physically, at our museums, actually speaking at some of these engagements in the context of being in person that represents a museum, but still understanding that our role has kind of changed now. And I would dare say that I embrace the fact that it's time for change, and that the time for change is for the better. Because what better sources of change than institutions who accurately collect and, for the most part, accurately depict what has been a part of our history, past, present. It should be museums. It should be people who actually rely on data, scientific data, actual recounts of history, actual data, not politicians who create data or misinterpret data. So this is a very good change of how we've evolved as museums. And quite frankly, it is something that we now at America's Black Holocaust Museum are embracing, that is an addition to our mission, which is basically just to bring awareness of the horrible legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, but creating an awareness through discussions and programming that promotes repair, reconciliation, and healing. And so that's the basic mission of our institution as passed down from Dr. James Cameron. So the future of the museum is to really embrace this virtual presence right now, to be a convener and a participant in webinars and sessions like this one. We have a historian, Dr. Robert Smith, who has been involved in extensive programming around social justice. And so our vision is to, of course, open the museum, but the museum is going to be small. It's in a small footprint, but realizing now through the mechanism of the virtual museum that we could actually have a small physical footprint, but we could have an endless infinity of information through our virtual museum. And through our virtual activities, we can engage tens of hundreds of thousands of individuals throughout this country and abroad by bringing experts in on subject matter around post-slavery and the effects of post-slavery on all participants in the United States, all cultures, all ethnicities. So our future is bright. I'll tell you, and I will, if you guys care to understand about some of the realities of COVID on cultural institutions. As Cynthia said, I'm on 2 national boards around museums. One is the American Alliance Museum, and that's the national/international membership umbrella organization for all museums and cultural institutions in the United States. That's from botanical gardens to science museums, zoos and aquariums, art museums, history museums, all of them that are accredited fall under that umbrella. I'm also a board member of the Association of African American Museums. And that's all, quite frankly, the Black museums in the country. And so because of the pandemic, as you guys all know, this country is shut down. And we have seen so many factions of our economy shut down. And here are some of the hard facts about our industry. And that is, we're predicting that somewhere between 2021 and 2022, that we're going to lose 30% of all museums. Some are going to be able to reopen, but they won't be able to sustain themselves, so they're going to eventually close again. That's 3 out of every 10. So now let's look at Black museums. So several of you have heard the adage, when America sneezes, Black folks get a cold. What that equates to is, if 30% of all museums in the United States will not only be able to reopen and stay open, close to 45 to 50% of all African American museums will never be able to open again or reopen and sustain themselves. So just let that sink in for a while. Potentially every 4 to 5 museums that have cultural content around the Black and Brown experiences won't be able to reopen. So it is a very challenging time for us. And so one of the reasons that we've been successful in being able to at least predict that we will be sustainable, at least in the short term, is that because we never opened, we basically decided to shut everything down. And we had a very good idea of what our monthly expenses were going to be. And so we knew that we weren't going to be able to earn any revenue by the museum being open. We knew that we then had to shift to all of our raised revenue. And so I hired a really sharp fund development consultant, and she was able to raise a substantial amount for the museum during the fourth quarter, where we actually ended up 2020 with a surplus, which is uncanny and unheard of. And I'm not saying this to brag or anything. It was really fate. It was us being prudent financially, and being fortunate from the vantage point that there were several institutions, for-profit institutions, who at this point really wanted to be supportive of organizations in our space, organizations that deal with human rights, social rights, civil rights. And we were fortunate to receive funding from several of these organizations. So that's how we were able to survive. But I encourage you, those of you who visit museums, who are volunteers in museums, who know people that work in museums, or in any of these not-for-profit or cultural institutions that you deem and you feel are noteworthy and are necessary, that you provide some kind of support for them through your donations or contributions, volunteerism. They could probably use all of you in some capacity, because we're all going to need your help, because all of our efforts are still important, although necessary. So I've shied away from describing each and every photograph, because I'm being kind of stingy and saying, I don't want you to get the museum experience now. I want you to visit us. But this is probably the most powerful part of the museum. This is the part where, quite frankly, when I started working here in 2019, as I was being interviewed for several news outlets and media outlets, I will be very honest and candid with you that for the first 3 to 5 interviews I got here, started talking, and had to take 5 and go to my office and collect myself. This is a stylized tree that represents the trees of which African American men and women and others have been hung. This corner depicts 2 things. One, on the left side, the actual photograph that was shown earlier of the 2 individuals that were lynched and the one that Dr. Cameron survived. The writing that is exhibited on the left panel from the top talks about the song Strange Fruit which was first sung by Billie Holiday. The song comes from a poem and writings from a writer named by the last name of Mirapol. And the connotation of strange fruit is, why are these men hanging from trees as if they are fruit? And isn't that strange? Strange fruit. At the bottom, which is being covered by several of these individuals who were here when they first had a grand opening back in 2018, when the building was still unfinished. It depicts it has the picture of the two individuals that were hung, but it also has a picture, Dr. Cynthia, of a gentleman that was actually lynched and burned in Omaha, Nebraska, in the early 1900s. The panel on the right talks about Ida B. Wells. And for those of you who don't know, Ida B. Wells was a woman, a historian, a journalist out of Chicago, Illinois, who was the only person known to chronicle each and every lynching, starting from the early 1900s through, I believe, the 1950s, before she died. And then it also talks about A. Philip Randolph and the early beginnings of the NAACP. Dr. Cynthia, I'm wondering if this is a time when I should continue to talk, or should we take some questions if there are any in the queue?
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Absolutely. I think this was very intriguing, excellent information to whet our appetite for the work that you and the staff are doing at the Black Holocaust Museum, and to whet our appetite for further research independently of, at all museums. But at this time, audience members may send questions to me, the moderator, to pose to Dr. Davis via the chat, and I have questions already in queue. The first one is, do you have any specific suggestions or examples of best practices of faculty? And I do want to thank and acknowledge several faculty and staff are on this in this call right now from Metropolitan Community College. I see your faces. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hesitate for a shout out to give you a shout out because of course, invariably I'd forget someone, but I see you, I see you. But do you have any specific suggestions or examples of best practices for faculty and staff to use the resources of America's Black Holocaust Museum?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And Dr. Sinha, it's very smart of you not to give any shout outs, because invariably you're going to make somebody mad. And then you'll have to pay for it after the call. So one of the things that we all benefit from now, that many of us on this call did benefit from when we were growing up, or when we were even in college doing graduate or postgraduate work, is the internet. And so I'm not necessarily a big proponent of some of these websites, but we do know that we can go to other organizations whose work is that, the foundation of their work is around history and the critical study of whatever it is is designated as part of your curriculum. So I would say that my perspective would be, if I were actually teaching now, which of course I'd be teaching something else because of my training, but it would be to look at it at the macro level and then transcend to the micro level. Because the one thing that I do know about connecting people to subject matter, regardless of whether it's in a museum or if it's in a classroom, and that is relevance. If subject matter is relevant to someone, if it strikes a chord with them, you typically then get them to become more engaged. And they just don't look at it as just an exercise to get from point A to point B. And so relevance is really, really important. And start with the macro and go down to the micro, because as many of you as educators know, one of the tenets of education is you tell them, you tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them again. And the other thing is they tend to remember the last thing you told them. So you want them to also look at the history around Omaha, because what we're finding out through a lot of the unfolding of the truth around our history of Blacks in America, people in America, is that there's so much current history that is hidden that we are either not aware of or we've got misinformation about that, and that we need to search for the correct information. So I would start it from, quite frankly, at the National Museum for African American History and Culture. And that's part of the newest installation as part of the Smithsonian. Mm-hmm. They have probably one of the most comprehensive collections of data around the difference. I was asked last week about the difference between our museum and their museum. And first of all, I'd say about $600 million. But the other thing is, degrees of scale. And so they have looked at the Black experience starting pre-colonialism. And then
in Africa, quite honestly.
Right. So everything from pre-colonialism to date. And so depending upon what your subject matter is, I'd say that there are websites that are very, very credible. The AAM's website that they can show you and point you in directions to archives of other museums. So I would stick to institutions that are doing this work at the macro level. But then the other thing is individuals that are doing this work. So if any of you have any questions about, well, what books do you think I should read? I mean, there's like so many books out there now, most especially because of our current situation. But Dr. Ibrahim, who has the book about being an anti-racist, the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project is probably one of these most comprehensive projects to date around this subject matter of slavery and post-slavery effects, pre-slavery, and slavery and post-slavery. So there are a lot of things that you can, and sources that you can go to at the macro level. But then I would strongly suggest that you look at some and count on some of your local historians and look at the state, and then what has happened in a city like Omaha or its current surroundings, because there's a lot of rich history nationally, but there is a lot of relevant history locally.
Thank you. The next question is, there's been a few questions about local Black museum. I put that web address in the chat. So the next question is, I apologize for the delay. Here we go. What can we, the public, do to help counteract the reality that many museums may not survive the pandemic?
So I'm going to start off a little brash and then explain it. So I had a board member in Chicago who said these words to me, and they've rung true ever since he said it, probably back in 2001. He said, Dr. BERT, all roads lead to money. He said, you could have the most fantastic programmatic thoughts, but if you've got no dough, you got no show. And so that being said, we all need to have money to survive, to operate. But there's a series of some things that you can do. On the advocacy side, you can contact your state, local, and congressional delegation around creation of legislation So right now, I'm sure that probably some of you on this call have been the beneficiaries of the PPP loans. Some of you might have been the beneficiary of the National CARES Act. All of these have been generated through, they call it the stimulus, but it's not a stimulus. A stimulus takes you from one place and moves you to another. These are relief packages. This is money that if it's not distributed to people, they're going to perish, right? There's a difference between stimulus and relief. But you could actually advocate on behalf of your state delegation and your congressional delegation to then provide more funding, national funding, that then gets funneled to states that will then cover not-for-profits and museums. So that has actually happened. Our museum has actually received PPP loan forgiveness, and we've actually received CARES funding. And so you as an individual can advocate on behalf of your museums and your cultural institutions at that level. So advocacy is one. If in fact you don't have the wherewithal to give tons of money, give what you can. Word of mouth about the plight, because oftentimes people don't understand what's going on at institutions, or you don't even know what's going on with your friends unless they tell you.
Right.
And so advocating with your friends and your own groups, even though we're in a pandemic, but we still have virtual groups that we talk about. And so if you know that there are people who you know support these organizations and they aren't able to visit them because they're closed, advocate for them on their behalf. And then at some point when they reopen, and if they're able to reopen, volunteer. Because what most cultural institutions do benefit from is, depending upon the size of your workforce and your volunteer force, volunteers, which quite frankly are just unpaid staff, if the program is managed correctly, can count for as much as 25% of your budget in expense savings, salary and benefit savings. So if you have a large cadre of volunteers that, of course, are well-trained, have the passion, but are well-trained, they could actually be budget relieving for your expense line from your finances and your budget, up to as much a quarter of your total budget. That's substantial savings. So those are a few of the things that you could do as an individual to help these organizations that you love and are dear to you in your community.
Thank you for that response. The next question is, sadly, lynching is still occurring in 2021, not on trees, but through many racial injustices and inequalities, or inequities, I apologize, in institutions. Conversations are great, which promote awareness. You mentioned that you will host roundtables to have these difficult discussions. The question is, how do you take these conversations to action and excitement for change?
That's a great question, but it's also one of the most difficult. That is, how do you convert talking to actual action? And so that's where it matters who's leading the discussion, because oftentimes you can just have, so let me give you an example, right? So for me, I learned early on in my career that when you have important things that are going to create consistency within your department or your organization, and in many times creates what we call a paradigm shift in how you operate, you can't sit around the table with your colleagues or your staff and create a strategic plan or a mission or a vision, because you guys are kind of set in how you already have this construct of communication. You got to bring in an expert, unless somebody around that table is trained in doing that. So I say that to say that when we are going to be convening these discussions, just as with our first program of the Black History Month, the February 1st, when we had a roundtable of members of our staff, we had someone to actually facilitate the discussion. And because she is a professional in this realm, she, number one, was prepared and knew how to move the conversation along to an ultimate conclusion. And so I would suggest that when we are having these discussions, that when we start to convene these discussions, where we know that there needs to be some obvious conclusion that is an action item. So for example, with us, my assistant and research assistant, Mia Pfeiffer, who I think is on this call, she is an expert at taking notes and then out of those notes pulling what she calls action items based on what we said we were going to do, and then recapping those action items and sending them to the individuals on the board or on the staff that reminds us, you need to do this, you said you're going to do this. But it creates that level of accountability, but it also creates this continuum of, we're going to build upon the last meeting with the action items that have been accomplished for this meeting, preparing us for the next meeting. And so you can't host and convene these discussions harem scarum. They have to be actually plotted in a way that, depending upon the subject matter, you've already kind of predetermined where you want to end up. If you end up in other more fruitful places, then it's a bonus. But if you don't have that kind of structure, then you'll just have a bunch of people sitting around the table talking, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, sometimes screaming. So you got to put it in a context where there needs to be some specific goals that you want to accomplish.
Thank you. Please tell us about upcoming exhibits at your museum.
So because we're not going to be opening, I can tell you about a couple of our previous programming that you could still access. And that is, for MLK Day back in January, we decided to do a non-traditional celebration of Dr. King, where we've all grown up hearing about his speeches and learning about his life. But we have in Milwaukee the Wisconsin Black Historical Society that is led by this brilliant historian by the name of Claiborne Benson. And so I had the idea and presented it to the team, and we all agreed that we wanted to have a different slant on MLK Day. So we asked Claiborne how many times Dr. King actually visited the state of Wisconsin, and how many times did he actually visit Milwaukee. And so I knew we were in for a treat when I started describing this to Claiborne, and Claiborne interrupted me and said, well, you know, people think that he came 10 times, but he actually came 13 times. And so I just stopped him right then and I said, okay, dude, you're on. And so what we learned was that Dr. King actually had some really interesting interactions with several of the churches, several of the church leadership, and that actually, because he visited Wisconsin, the first statue that was erected in his honor was not in Milwaukee, where you would have presumed it would have been, because Milwaukee has the largest African-American population in the state of Wisconsin. It wasn't. It was in Racine, Wisconsin. And it gave a lot of people who were here, as a matter of fact, invariably everyone who tuned in, who lived here, grew up here, had no idea that Dr. King had visited so many times. And what happened during he was a catalyst for several other social actions that occurred after he left. So you can still find that. And then we started on February 1st with a roundtable of our staff, which was, like I said, facilitated by a professional facilitator here, Denise Thomas. Yesterday, I interviewed Judge Derek Mosley, who's a friend, a colleague from Chicago. He has, over the last 10 and a half years, 12 years, has published a series of little known Black history facts along on all of social media. If you, he's maxed at his number of Facebook friends, and I think Instagram. I don't even know how Instagram works, but if you follow him, he has some of the most unique stories. For example, he talked about the Sears Roebuck catalog and how Sears Roebuck catalog actually changed the way and the fabric, not only for all Americans, but Black Americans. Because in the Deep South, you couldn't buy certain things or you were the last in line, but you could now order them on Sears Roebuck's catalog. And I remember growing up that I got my first ant farm from Sears. I remember, my parents, I tried to order chickens from Sears, and we lived in an apartment in Chicago, and my parents almost lost their minds when they found out I was trying to order some chickens.
A true veterinarian.
That makes sense now, doesn't it? But here's the thing that he shared, and then I'm going to move along. He said back then you couldn't buy guns and ammunition from any white gun dealer, but you could buy guns and ammunition from Sears. They'd ship it to you. And he said the movement of the deacons,
Deacons for Defense.
The Deacons for Defense.
In Bogalusa, Louisiana, that was my sister-in-law's father was one of those deacons.
And I bet he got his guns from Sears.
Sears and Roebuck.
So we interviewed him yesterday, and the phone, the questions were just, we couldn't even get to all the questions. We couldn't get to nearly half of the questions because there's so much information that has been misinformed or not informed, like the Statue of Liberty, what the Statue of Liberty actually looked like when it was first designed versus what it looks like when it got here. There's just so much history around all ethnicities in all cultures, all women, that we have just purposefully not shared, purposefully not taught, have not become the fabric of our traditions. So that was yesterday. Next week, we're going to do a sneak peek as a virtual sneak peek of the museum. And then, as I referred to before, at the end of the week, we're going to have a book club. We're going to have a reoccurring monthly book club, and we're in the process now of having discussions with several news outlets and the Wisconsin Black Historical Society and several film producers to start creating monthly programming. And you will be able to find out about that on our website and through all of our social media posts, ABHM or America's Black Holocaust Museum.
So I have one final question.
Almost on time.
It is, that's right. It is, will you be adding an exhibit for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, etc.?
So the answer to that is probably so. There's a couple interesting things around that question that I want to address. One is because of the vast amount of protesting that occurred after that series of unfortunate, just horrible deaths, that there are several museums that are being created around the country that will just display the graffiti and the billboards and all of the paraphernalia associated just with the Black Lives Matter protest and the protests themselves. So out of this protest, these series of protests are going to grow museums and exhibits that will illustrate and curate those experiences, which is just mind-blowing. And so that's going to happen. Because we have such small space and we have a lot of artifacts that are not from the previous museum, the older museum, that we have not even placed in the rotation yet. We're going to be constantly rotating exhibits in and out. So yes, I can foresee at some point that there will be either a temporary exhibit or a permanent exhibit around that. But let me just give you a bit of an experience, share an experience with you that was new to me, because as we've talked, my career has been in zoos and aquariums for almost 30 years. My life was lions and tigers and bears, oh my.
Oh
Right?
my.
So, the most controversial conversations I would have with people would be like, that lion's not doing anything. And I'm like, it's 100 degrees. Why are you even out here, right? Or my hot dog was cold, or the merry-go-round's not, though that was the extent of the headaches that I had from the public. One of the final exhibits as you're leaving the museum talks about not necessarily about specifically Black Lives Matter, but it illustrates Black Lives Matter through protest. But it starts off talking about the disparities in incarceration of African Americans. All right. And so the visuals are a snapshot of a picture of this well-known Black actor who was being incarcerated. For the life of me, I'm looking right at his face now and I can't call his name. And then next is a series of photographs of people protesting, women walking arm in arm, a woman actually confronting a phalanx of armed policemen with gas masks on, and then a young man in an alley putting his hands up, saying, the slogan, "Don't shoot." From that, someone who, because at one point we were allowing people to meet in our community space, and then we would tell them the museum's not open, it's not finished, but if you want to walk through and see our progress. From that, someone who had been to the museum for an event took to Facebook and he says, and we know it's a he, that the museum is anti-police. Now, there's nowhere in the exhibitry that says anything about being anti-police. There's nowhere that says anything other than we were just reporting facts and using pictures that we didn't take that were already out there. So as you can imagine, because of social media and how people gain so much courage sitting in front of a screen, during the course of that evening, it went from the museum is anti-police to the museum is anti-blue. Hey, we shouldn't tolerate that, to, hey, we should go down there. Hey, we should shut the museum down. Hey, we should burn the museum down. So as I said before, we're in a mixed purpose space. So there are apartments above our building, above our museum. But because of that, the magnitude in which it grew overnight, ladies and gentlemen, we had to call the police. It became a situation. And of course, the police found them, shut it down. But then the police suggest we even reported to the FBI, because if, let's say, something happened, it would be under the auspices of a hate crime. So I'm telling you that to say that once again, museums find ourselves in this very, very sensitive space of contextualizing and exhibiting things that are truthful, but based upon where people are in their journey, in their beliefs. We have to prepare ourselves for, there's always going to be someone who's contrary to the truth, always. But the reason I'm saying this, which is to say this final thing, and that is, we will always exhibit, curate, and contextualize the truth, and we will not be deterred in what we're doing.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. Davis, thank you for sharing your expertise on museums and the important work of America's Black Holocaust Museum. I want to add that a student messaged me, she had to go, and she said, and I quote, "This was so interesting. Dr. Davis has done a great job, and I hope to someday get to the ABHM." Dr. Davis, Barbara and I, on behalf of Metropolitan Community College, we appreciate you bringing our history to light, whether this be virtually during the pandemic or in the future when the museum will once again open its doors to the public. Ladies and gentlemen, Milwaukee is less than 8 hours away. Make it your business to visit virtually and when it opens, in person. To our audience, community members, students, staff, and faculty, thank you for prioritizing Black history, not just in February, but year-long in 2021 and beyond. Please put up our final slides. Oh, there's Samson. Samson, hush. Don't forget to complete the online evaluation at mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL. We look forward to seeing you at the next virtual Black History Month program that will be held this evening at 6 p.m. It is our final program of celebrating Black History Month, but we, as you know, at Metro celebrate all year long. And join us to view the documentary John Lewis, Get in the Way, and participate in a discussion about the film led by Dr. Donnell Moore, Executive Pastor of Salem Baptist Church. Faculty, students, and staff, please continue to be safe. And in wrapping up this winter quarter, have a successful, finish strong, folks, finish strong, and study your syllabus. It's in the syllabus, right? See you this evening. And again, Dr. Davis, thank you so very much.
Thanks. Oh, well, that's funny. It's in the syllabus. That's true. It's in the syllabus. Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure, and good luck to all of you. And we look forward to seeing you at the museum.
All right. People are coming off mute. Go ahead if you want to give a shout out.
Thank you. This was awesome. Awesome.
Thank you. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Good
to see you, Janet. Good to see you, Dr. Davis.
Good to see you
Good to see you,
too.
Brian, Marty,
Thank
everybody.
you. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Thank you.
Yeah. 06, Fred.
Thanks, everybody in Metro staff. I appreciate y'all.
Meredith.
Thank you.
Meredith.